Well, I'm going to get started then. I basically just want to start out by welcoming everyone and thanking everyone for being here today. This is the university's inaugural commemoration and memorial dedication. This is the beginning of a new tradition here at the University of Washington to pay tribute to our research animals and equally important to you. This is something that I think we all can address and feel that it's extremely difficult what we do, and also realizing that what we do is extremely important and very rewarding to advance human and animal health. So this is for our animals and for each of you. And just briefly, I'm really trying to follow a script because everybody that knows me, I can go on for about a half an hour. But I just want to briefly mention that this Dare to Care, we formed this it'll be 7 years in October of 2016. And one of the target objectives was to have a commemoration because it's long overdue. I've been here 31 years, and it's when I was doing research in the late mid-90s, I had some issues with some mishaps and things like that, and I had no one to talk to. So when I left the bench and took my current position in Office of Animal Welfare, it was something that I felt was much needed, but it was never talked about. So with leadership that had come in, Dr. Sally Thompson-Aratani was kind of wondering the same thing. Why don't we have someone or a program to help support one another? And so we got it going. And I just want to say it was my number one target objective. But after realizing everything that was causing CF for other folks, it was just one of many things we need to address here. So it's been a work in progress. And this day is like, I just can't believe it's here, 7 years. So with that said, I'm going to move to my script and just thank Dare to Care members, past and present. All the folks in purple shirts today are on the Dare to Care, and I can't thank you enough. And I know that I can barely see as it is without my glasses. There they are. But I know I've seen some past members in here. Sarah, I just see you right now. You know, you guys are what's got us here. It's all of your dedication, commitment, effort. You guys are such a great team to work with, honestly. I love each of you. And I also really want to call out and thank Annika Kaiser. Annika Kaiser is joining us via Zoom. Unfortunately, she can't be here because she's in Switzerland, which is not very fair. But Annika was absolutely instrumental in helping us get our feet off the ground. So thank you, Annika. I know you're watching the Zoom. I hope you can hear me. If you can't, we'll get a video over to you. I'm also going to reemphasize thanking all of you, our research faculty and staff, our animal caregivers, our vets, our vet techs, our cage wash team, our logistics team, our behavioral management team. All of you are amazing. And again, this is about us. We got to start taking care of one another. I also want to thank the IACUC. I'm on the IACUC, and I know sometimes IACUC is like the police, but we're not. We're here to ensure our animal use program is one of the best in the country, if not the world. So thank the IACUC. And lastly, I have to thank the Office of Animal Welfare, my home department. My crew's here, the team's here, the leadership in that office is amazing. And without them, this wouldn't be possible. And I just appreciate you hearing me complain and the ups and downs. You guys have been great to work with. I have the best job, the best coworkers, so I thank you all. And then lastly, I just want to pay special recognition, actually two more lastlies. I want to thank everybody in Arizona at our Arizona breeding colony. I know you guys can't be here. We have 2 members out in Arizona. Thank you all for what you do. We really appreciate it. And then lastly, this is the official lastly before I introduce our special guest. I'd like to actually just acknowledge an endowment that helped pay for everything. And this endowment was set up by Disa Haas in 1982. That endowment was originally given to the Hope Heart Institute. When the Heart Institute dissolved in 2017, their board of directors voted to transfer the endowment to us, to the University of Washington, to support animal research. And I'm just going to pay special thanks to Bob, who has listened to me for 7 years, trying to find budget, and so he's been a huge supporter of the program. So thank you to the endowment for making all this possible. And I'm going to give them a round of applause. So. All right, so it's like more than an honor to introduce our keynote. I'm actually just stunned that I actually got to have a phone call with him a few months ago, let alone meet him in person and have dinner next to him last night. But this is an individual who I was referencing his material as my third slide of my presentation 6.5 years ago, and then the fact that he's here in the room is amazing. Our keynote today is Arnold Arluke. He's Professor Emeritus of Sociology and Anthropology at Northeastern University, Senior Scholar at Tufts School of Veterinary Medicine, and a research consultant to the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. His research has examined the conflicts and contradictions in human-animal relationships. Currently, he is studying the problems of increasing veterinary access in low-income communities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Arluke.
I'd like to thank Preston and Sally for inviting me to speak at this special occasion. As many of you know, when academics publish, you often don't know what impact your work has, unless you go into Google Citations and count the number of times your articles were cited, or ResearchGate to see how many times your work has been read. Hearing that my research had some significance or resonance for Dare to Care is enormously meaningful for me and for my work, so thank you very much for that. There are 3 parts to my talk. You can see I'm a well-trained academic lecturer. I can't help but outline everything I do. The first part, I'm going to talk about what I did with my research 40 years ago. This is painting a picture of the state of emotional norms in bench science many decades ago, and hopefully we'll compare that to what's going on today. Secondly, I'm going to talk about a more global picture of tributes to animals and memorials to animals to put what's happening today into a larger context. That's the anthropologist in me. And then finally, I want to talk about what's happening today, the bench, the plaque, and the annual commemoration, and why I think that's a significant advance over prior memorials to animals in labs. My field work started almost 40 years ago to the day. I introduced myself when I would go into labs as an anthropologist wishing to be the next Margaret Mead, but in this case of animal cultures in animal labs, which in hindsight was probably a mistake to do because half of my subjects had no idea who Margaret Mead was. And at the time, her work was being overturned and invalidated, but not one person ever said that to me, so I escaped. Nevertheless, this introduction worked. And 7 years later, I had visited 17 different laboratories, interviewed approximately 250 scientists, research fellows, technicians, caretakers, lab animal vets, IACUC members, and administrative and support personnel, and even patients and staff members in the buildings who had nothing to do with the lab itself, but were aware that it was there. Some of the labs I mentioned to Preston last night, I stayed in for up to 2 years, and I would go in usually 40 hours or more a week. And in some of the labs, I was also given work to do. This is called being a marginal native. You hang around a group long enough, you don't want to be conspicuous, so you're often grateful if they'll have you do something. It's also a way of saying thank you. If I'm going to hang around, I'll do something you don't want to do. And I was often given tasks that no one wanted to do. This was an exception. I loved doing my chimp socialization, and they were happy for me to do it, but that was the exception. More typically, I would do things like weigh the weight of test tubes for 4 hours, and if you ever want to torture someone, have them do that. During my field work in labs, I saw 3 large informal rules, we call them norms, that discouraged certain behaviors. And the first was deny your feelings, don't express your feelings. I first learned this norm about don't show your sentiment or feeling for animals by accident. At the time, I was doing research at the public health school on folk beliefs that rheumatoid arthritis patients have about their illness that affect whether they take their medications. It's called a compliance study. The doctors I was working with at the hospital had to run an errand to the sub-basement, which I didn't know was the euphemism for the animal labs. And this was, by the way, in the era where there weren't dedicated sections or wings or buildings for research. The labs I was in often had patients being treated right above us or below us, usually above us. So I went to the basement with my doctor friend to run his errand. We go into the room, and I didn't know this was an active animal lab about to use dogs in an imaging study. They were looking at how to image a heart after a heart attack. Dogs were used as the model. I walked in, and one of the dogs, which should have been caged, was free, ran over to me and did what dogs would do. It went over to my leg, looked up at me as a dog lover. Of course, I instinctively bent over, started playing with it. I was happy, the dog was happy. The doctor I walked in with gave me the look. And we left quickly, and he wasn't furious, but he was upset. And immediately I had this kind of, this is how I'm wired. I thought I'd ruined something. I spilled reagent, I contaminated the dogs. He said, in a lab, if you go into any animal lab, never interact with the animals like they're pets. He said, everyone in the lab won't be able to do what they're about to do, which was to put down the dog. So when I left, 3 things happened. First of all, I felt terrible about the dog, since I didn't know that that was in the cards. I felt badly because I ruined the researchers' day there. They're going to have trouble doing their work. But I also knew that my next project was born. So years later, I'm still in labs. The experience I had in this first lab visit is symptomatic of something I saw throughout my study, which is a taboo against really 2 things. One is expressing positive feelings for animals and sentiment for animals, but also expressing troubles about what you're doing in labs. The taboo that suggested that one shouldn't form positive relationships with animals or express them was violated, though, all the time. Most labs, I think maybe only one of the 17 labs I visited didn't, and that was usually a primate lab. It was hard to do this, but especially in rodent labs, there was always one animal that was taken aside from the experiment and used as the lab's pet. They were usually sequestered in a closet, and this was kept secret, usually from the PI, sometimes even the chief technician, and certainly the lab animal vet wouldn't know, but all the technicians knew this. And there was often extravagant love provided to this one animal. And again, one of my marginal native jobs was to feed and take care of the little rat pets in the lab. One of them actually broke his leg. I don't know how that happened. And they convinced a fellow in orthopedic surgery at Mass General to come and fix the leg of the rat. And we had to arrange this when we knew the lab vet wasn't coming, and we knew the PI was in Puerto Rico at a convention. That's positive feeling. But troubled feelings were also part of lab life. And these were more deeply concealed. In fact, in many cases, I was the only one who knew. I often felt like they were in confession because, as we'll see today, and as you know, people often feel like they can't express what they're feeling with others. But I was safe. It's what I wanted to hear, and people would share it with me. 2 things made it difficult for people to share their difficult feelings with others. One was everyone assumed no one else felt the way they did. And it was always strikingly interesting to me that this could happen over time, but it did. Even when I would go out for beers with people after a hard day in the lab, where animals were put down or there was an experiment that was difficult to do, I thought over beers, after 2 hours, someone's going to, no one ever did. And the other reason why I think people didn't share with others what they were feeling is that they assumed, which may have been true, that if they shared their difficult feelings, it would make other people feel awful too. So the consequence was no one spoke about this except to me. Such distress continues. This was not just something that happened 40 years ago. I was honored to meet Connor Sessions last night. And as most of you or all of you know, the article in Science featured Connor's. And Connor and I briefly talked about this last night, about how he also felt distress in labs over how he felt and found it difficult to express his feelings. Again, something that Dare to Care obviously will be addressing and is aware of. But this sentiment that you shouldn't express your feelings or talk about difficulties in lab also affected my own talking about what happened in labs. It's called participant observation in sociology. I was invited to give a talk at Priminar. Some of you may have attended Priminar meetings. It's a professional nonprofit organization based in Boston. It used to be mostly to update researchers about the latest federal regulations. It's a little bit more than that. And they wanted me to talk about my work, so this is the title of the talk I chose. And they politely told me change the title because it's too controversial, that researchers don't feel guilt and we don't want people to think that, tone it down. So I said, do you have any suggestions? So they said, try stress. Somehow someone's stress sounds not as bad as someone feeling guilt. I gave the talk, it went well. 6 months later, the journal, or it's really more of a magazine, Lab Animal, some of you may read it, heard about my talk and said we should publish that. I was happy to hear that as an untenured assistant professor. But they didn't like the title. They said, stress is too controversial. Give us another title. And I said, do you have suggestions? Uneasiness. Sounds a little easier to manage. It gets worse because a few months after that, the first of a number of invitations I had from pharmacy companies. This was at SmithKline. And I'll talk about pharmacies, or pharmaceutical industry invitations later. They didn't like the title either. They thought uneasiness would spark outrage among senior investigators. So I said, I'm out of titles, and that was the title they chose. And in subsequent talks, I never tried to title anything I gave on this topic unless it was with social scientists, excuse me. So we're off and running, except I quickly encountered a second norm that affected communicating your sentiment about animal research. And that was, don't try to talk to other people about what you do. The problem I experienced then, and I assume this occurs in pockets still, is that the issue is so polarized, animal experimentation is so polarized, that it was difficult to talk to people, some for me on either side of the issue. People really didn't want to listen. They didn't want to hear about the complexities of human-animal relationships. They didn't want to hear how my work might humanize researchers. Instead, they had their own ideas, and they'd shut down communication. For example, this is not who she was, but this also dates me. We had secretaries back in the day, and they did our typing. And I had a great relationship with the department secretary. She typed all my exams, 8,000 multiple choice questions, but she refused to type any of the drafts to any of the papers I was putting out on animal experimentation because she said it upset her too much to even think about it. Even though I took her aside and I honored her reaction, but I tried to explain that I'm not going to have details of experiments. I'm talking about the people. And she said, I won't touch it. She went to the department chair and very upset, and I was worried then as an untenured professor even more, that what's he going to do? And he said, he took me aside, I remember, he said, don't give her any of your work. And he said, you'll have to type it yourself. I said, fine. But it wasn't just my secretary who didn't want to hear about what I was doing. There was a professor in the philosophy department, Bart. He and I were, I thought, buddies. We would have lunch maybe once a week, maybe every other week, and we'd talk about our students, our vacation plans. Until the day my work had started, and I had been in the field a little bit, and I brought it up. I said, I'm excited. I was very excited at the beginning that I finally got into a lab. I mentioned to Preston it took me over somewhere between 12 and 15 labs before I got any lab to let me in. And I mentioned it to Bart, and the atmosphere of the lunch quickly evaporated. Very soon he said he had to get back to his office sooner than he expected. It was very mysterious. And then he got up and started walking away, and he said, I don't know why you're bothering with that study. He said, you should be thinking about one thing. He said, you should be, and I don't know if he was joking, but he quickly shut down the conversation. He said, you should be thinking about how to bomb the lab. My lunches with Bart continued. I never brought up my research again. I could give you more examples than you'd like to hear about people shutting me down. And again, the use of this in anthropology is this is not anecdotal. This is my hypothesis. So I'd go back to labs and say, my friend at work did this. And then they would start giving me their experiences. And I wouldn't even have thought to ask until it happened to me, and that's the value of participant observation. Lack of a response or interest in what I was doing or willingness to hear what I was finding also occurred among people who were pro-animal research or advocates for it. In the late 80s, I think 88, I published this article in a journal which I doubt anyone here would read, called Anthrozoos. You see, I can see all the hands go up. It's a social science journal. It's a great journal. It was the first one in this area. Andrew Rowan was the editor. He invited me to write this paper. He thought it was so important. He invited about 14 scholars globally to comment on my article, which again, as an academic, it's a real honor, and I was thrilled. Philosophers, anthropologists, historians talked about what I did. It was not all positive, but valid criticism, until he tried to solicit a lab animal vet. The group that had most resistance to my work, that was, I would call pro-animal research, were lab animal vets. And I have some theories for this as to why this happened, if you want to hear later on. But he was finally able to get one lab animal vet to comment. He couldn't even get lab animal vets at his own university, who he was friends with, to comment. One of them privately, he told Andrew not to tell me, Andrew told me, so much for gossip, that he said, Arluke hates us. Arluke hates us, based on my research. The one veterinarian who did respond was at Washington State, and apparently he responded because the dean, who was the one who got the request from Andrew to comment, didn't want to do it either, and put pressure on the lab animal vet below him to provide the commentary, which wasn't. He mostly focuses on how my work was all anecdotal, which is the easy criticism of doing field work. However, there were two groups that did want to listen. One were research technicians and caretakers. I was invited to a lot of ALAS meetings, state-level meetings, and I would go. They were always in cities I didn't want to go to, but I wanted to talk to these groups because they were very eager to listen and very excited about my work. And usually at the end of each talk, I would be swarmed at the front of the podium or wherever I was speaking, where people were eager to tell me their stories. But it was interesting, even in that context, they wouldn't talk to me loud enough so that people could hear. They would line up and then kind of take me aside and say, yes, I had to do this, and I felt this way, and walk away, and then the next person would tell me their story. They were eager to have someone to share their stories with, but had no one to go to. Pharmaceutical companies, I mentioned I'd come back to these. Pharmaceutical companies also often invited me to talk to their research staff. Even though they would change the titles of my talk, they, I think, were aware of the fact that their researchers and their technicians were experiencing troubles in the lab, and they wanted to acknowledge it somehow. They didn't know how to do it. They had nothing operating within the industry. They had no committee, no group, no one hired to go to, at that point, no compassion fatigue measures. But they thought, bring Arluke in maybe once a year. It's like bringing Johnny Cash into prisons and sing once a year. Bring Arluke in, and that will address this issue. Thirdly, this is the last of the three big emotional norms, is not only is communication difficult, you might think about not even telling people you do this work. People were doing more than shutting down conversations. They were also sending you a message, or sending first me a message, which I would confirm with my subjects, that if you're involved with animal research, it's morally wrong. And they often wanted you to know that when you'd have these conversations, which frequently became testy. And I went through many of these testy moments myself. Again, I'm not doing animal research, and I'm experiencing this. One of my first marginal native jobs was to help clean mouse cages. That's what a PhD gets you. And for me to do this, I would have dozens of cages on a little wheeled rack. I would take it from the lab at the hospital and take the nearest elevator down to the cage rooms where they would be cleaned. And I would come in contact with people who weren't in research. Again, nowadays that wouldn't happen. It did here. I would bump into patients, medical staff, administrators, and they would see me wheeling the cages. People would sneer, make comments, and this wasn't so bad until I found out one day that the guy who would always sit across from me on the red line, this is a train in Boston, commuter line in Boston, also worked at the hospital, and one day saw me wheeling the mouse cages The next day I saw him on the train. He turned to me and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Good morning, mouse killer." And I never took the train at that hour again. I went back to the lab and told people in the lab about this experience, plus the hassle I would get in the hallway, and they laughed, which they say if when you do field work in a new culture, if you understand the humor and the laughter, you really understand the culture. They laughed because they all had those experiences. They said, in fact, they set me up as a rite of passage. They said, there's another elevator you could have taken. You weren't aware of it. I said, thanks a lot. I learned this lesson in the lab I studied, but when I told my subjects about this unpleasant experience, it wasn't just the people in the one lab that I was studying that had this experience. I would talk to research fellows and PIs who did as well, and there was a general pattern of this, which led me to write the article on the right called Going into the Closet with Science, which really focuses on all the different techniques that individuals would develop on their own to avoid these testy moments, which if you're working in a lab that had implications for cancer treatment, you would never mention you'd use animal models, but you're doing cancer research, and that would go over very well. And you would hope people wouldn't then start pressing you. And I heard this from PIs who couldn't talk to their children about their work. They wanted to bring their kids in because they were proud of their work, but they didn't know how to handle that. One person broke up with his fiance because she was upset that he did. Endless stories about how you end up feeling like you have to really filter everything about your work with the general public, friends and family as well. One exception to this, James Mahoney was the lab animal vet at NYU's primate lab called LEMSIP, which is no longer there. And I spent 6 months at LEMSIP. The first slide that I had of me with a chimp was at LEMSIP. James was unusual. One of the things he did was to try to set an atmosphere in his lab where everyone felt very comfortable expressing difficult feelings as well as affection for animals in the lab. To the point where the first day I was there, Jim took me back to his house for a beer. You do have a lot of beers when you do field work. And Jim showed me his photo album, family album, and I thought, this is a little odd. First time you meet someone here, look at my family album. And I'm going through, there's pictures of the kids playing Little League, family Thanksgiving meal, and there's a chimp on the table with them. And the new car, family buys a new car, and there's chimp waving in the back seat. Part of it shows his willingness to, he included them in his family album, but he also would bring some of them home, which by every regulation I think you could violate. It's violated. Each chimp had their own TV, and they were able to operate the controls for programs. They had music. He cut music for them to choose. He cut holes in the walls, which again was a USD. He had so many violations piled up there. And workers liked it too. I showed you the slide of me with the chimp. One of the things he would do when he picked people for the job, where I was talking to Preston briefly about this last night, about how important it is as to who does the selection of employees. And they would test the new worker, and he was testing me. The first day I was there, they put me in the chimp lab, wanted to see how I would react to being with the chimp. And I never found out exactly what they would find it as a behavior that would exclude someone from working there. But he wanted to see if I passed the test, and I did. At the moment when one of them had grabbed my leg and was dragging me across the floor, the other had picked up about a 60-pound dollhouse that it was about to throw on me. And the door flew open, and they ran in and said, well, you're welcome, you'll be here for 6 months. I said, thanks a lot. And the chimp had my watch still. Unfortunately, James also experienced enormous stress. Part of his sense of openness about the lab was he invited in animal activists, invited them in. Jane Goodall said, she told me at one meeting that she's opposed to animal research, but if you had to have it, she would have it the way they conducted it at LEMSIP. He invited journalists in, and the general public, the community where LEMSIP was located, Tuxedo, New York, were welcome to come. But it created enormous stress for him. In addition to that stress, one of the studies they did here was an simian AIDS study. And Jim, he wouldn't let his workers do it because it was too difficult a thing to do. there would be pairs of chimps, juvenile chimps, and you would have to pick which one would get the simian AIDS injection and which wouldn't. And Jim died of cirrhosis. And people close to Jim are convinced that the drinking was related to the stress he experienced. The irony is he was doing all of these things for his staff to relieve their stress, yet he himself was unable to really deal with it. But a remarkable man. I would dedicate this talk to him if I could do that. Second part of our talk is how can we remember lab animals? And Jim's technicians did something that was also interesting. When a chimp would die that was a favorite there, and there were many favorites, some of the workers would bury the chimp in the back, again, a USD violation. And there was an area of all these rocks in the back were graves. And some workers would go at the burial, word of mouth, everyone in the lab knew it was happening. If you didn't go, some people would visit the stones later and sit with the stones. My feeling was that, by the way, this was all kept secret again. The PI didn't know this, the higher-ups at NYU had no clue, but everyone in the lab knew that this was happening. My sense was that almost every lab I visited, there was also a desire to be able to remember animals that were worked with, either collectively as a group or individual animals. But they had no way to do this, no way to honor them. This isn't true elsewhere. Over 100 years ago in Japan, this is the earliest I could find, was the first ceremony for lab animals. And this is a stone memorial at the National Institute of Radiological Science in Japan that was set up, was erected in 1921, or I'm sorry, 1921 or 1922. And they would have an annual ceremony here. But even more interesting to me, in Japan around the same time, this was exactly 100 years ago, they would have an annual yearly ceremony nationally at every laboratory. Excuse my pronunciation, Irasai, which translates as comfort the soul. It was a 3-part ceremony for lab animals and staff members. This one at the National Center for Drug Development Solutions. This is actually a garden, and in the middle of the garden is the memorial. They decided to put the garden for lab animal ceremonies in front of the facility so the public could not see it. They wanted to have it be a community memorial. And it had 3 parts to the ceremony. The first part, people would come up, they were invited guests, and I can't find out what made you an invited guest. They would come up and do silent prayer and bring offerings. So they would bring fruit, vegetables, and sake. And the second part of the ceremony were other participants who weren't invited but there, who could come up and bring incense, which symbolized purification and mindfulness. And at the end of the ceremony, there would be speeches about the importance of animal welfare in labs. Japan was certainly not alone. Almost every Asian country I looked into had some lab animal ceremony. But Korea and Japan were the most prominent. This is a statue at a Korean lab that's 6.5 feet tall. It's hard to make out, but it's a person cradling a lab animal the way you would cradle a child. And this is at the Korean National Institute of Food and Drug Safety. The difference between Japan and Korea is the Korean ceremonies were never national, and some years some of the institutions didn't have it, so it was erratically followed. But Japan has been more consistent about this. And there's some material written about how it spread from Japan to Korea. But this is someone at this particular facility putting white chrysanthemums on the memorial, because they symbolize mourning and grief. So she's paying her respects. But what about the rest of the Western world in this time period, in the 1900s? Where are lab animals? If any of you have been to Edinburgh, Scotland, you know about Greyfriar Bobby. It's maybe the most famous pet memorial. Very quickly put, Bobby and his master were friends for 14 years. Bobby's master died of tuberculosis, I think in 1853, approximately. And Bobby went to the grave and apparently remained at the grave for 14 years. And the dog died. The city built a memorial to the dog. And also now you have Great Friar Bobby Bars. It's a bit like the Alamo in San Antonio, is it? This is a more modern example of a pet memorial in Western countries. This is a bench at the University of California, Irvine, to deceased pets. It even gets more interesting in Western countries because almost every animal you conceive of has a memorial of some sort, but not lab animals. This is a tribute to horses lost in World War I that was put up in 1926 in England. This is a memorial medal for heroic animals, not lab animals. There have been 65 recipients of them, 29 dogs, 32 messenger pigeons, 3 horses, and a cat. And in 1927, the Travelers, Friends of the Tunnelers, rather, memorial was put up also in Edinburgh. And this was a memorial to canaries and mice that were used in World War I. Apparently, the soldiers would dig a trench, a tunnel rather, under the enemy's trench and put bombs and then blow up the enemy's trench. But they would take canaries and mice with them because the enemy sometimes were aware of this and they'd put gas down and kill the tunnelers. So the mice and canaries saved their lives. But they have a memorial, but you might say there weren't a lot of animal labs then, but nothing else happened in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s. We have to come up, by the way, a few quick other examples, a memorial to war dogs, a memorial to police dogs, and police horses. These are more recent examples. But the first mention of any kind of ceremony to lab animals in Western countries that I could find was at the University of Guelph in 1993. They had an annual ceremony. I could not find out anything more about whether it's continued or not. Then here at UW, as they say, right, UW, doctors John Lynch and Bill Slaughter were students here at the time, and they started a memorial ceremony to animals, which lasted, I think, until the 2 of them left the university. And this is an article they published in Journal of Western Medicine about their annual memorial. It was very insightful and well written. Merck in 2002 started an annual animal ceremony, excuse me. Again, I'd have to do another phase of research to find out if they've continued this, but they at least started something in 2002. This is an odd one. It's a gravestone. It's really more of a small memorial than a gravestone. That's in Hartsdale, New York. That's commemorating the lives of animals lost in research. I could not find any more background material on who put it up and why they did it. And then in 2016, NIH finally gets into the act and has a ceremony for lab animals where they dedicated a plaque to lab animals, but not to researchers per se, but to the animals. So third part now is Dare to Care, and how I think Dare to Care's efforts are taking what's been done in Western countries and definitely moving it up several notches. I think that the plaque that is being dedicated today breaks new ground in 2 ways. One, Preston has already mentioned. It's amazingly inclusive, and I think that's very important. Preston mentioned all the different people who should be part of this and are, running from caregivers to research faculty to vets, vet techs, trainers, cage washers, behavioral management specialists, administrators involved in any capacity, people who order animals, order supplies. You mentioned IACUC members. I served in an IACUC at Tufts for 5 years. EH&S department, facilities personnel, and those do any kind of animal purchasing or supplies are all part of this picture as well, and you honor them, and I think that's an amazing step forward. The plaque second part, though, is also very important and has some sociological importance to me. The inscription is, as all of you know, is that it's not about just animal loss, but the human toll that happens. And my first interviewee made this really important point to me. He was the head of a radiology lab that was, as I mentioned, the first lab I studied. And in his office, I remember he took me aside. He said, I want you to remember one thing. He said, we are not wanton killers like the people you read about in the news or if you read fiction. And he said, what we do is sacrifice animals. We don't kill them. Well, And I know, obviously you do, but I understood what he was saying. His point was well made. My research started in an era when the word sacrifice was not forbidden. It was in grant proposals. Journal articles would say 6,000 mice were sacrificed. People at conferences, I would go to biomedical conferences because there was also another way I could interview people. They would use the word in their talks. But by the end of my field work, the word had been almost completely abandoned. And it was officially barred from appearing and being used in journal articles or, in grant applications. Partially because the term, I think, people felt had religious connotations that were inappropriate for modern science. I wrote this book with friends of mine in England because we actually felt that there's some reason to re-embrace the term sacrifice. And I think the plaque does this. And I think that's a very important advance in what Dare to Care is doing today. Finally, the plaque and bench are outside. It has a public presence. And I think this was important, as I understand, to Dare to Care for at least two reasons. One, it speaks to the idea that people who are doing animal research in any capacity and who are proud of it can be now comfortable talking to outsiders. But also they can reflect on their own work. And they can reflect on it, and maybe even after having a bad day, it's all the more important to be able to do that here. But I think having it outside in a public area is also important because it invites everyday people to be part of it. It's not just about researchers. Hopefully, after the next biomedical breakthrough happens here at UW, everyday people will walk by the bench and recognize how we got there, honoring, respecting, and being grateful for the sacrifices of all. But it's also my hope, and perhaps yours too, that it will not take a huge breakthrough for this to happen. We would hope that with the bench, passersby can reflect on the lives lost and the difficult feelings that are part and parcel of everyday life in labs. The nice thing about having something in public, again, to a sociologist or anthropologist, is it invites rituals to start to develop, and rituals are important to have happen with any memorial. Some people hopefully will return to your annual commemorations. Some people will frequently pass by the bench and maybe sit on it habitually for lunch. They will develop their own rituals in using the bench and reading the plaque. What at one time is a novel inscription for someone to read on the plaque becomes a taken for granted truism. With rituals, there's also an emotional energy in a ritual, and others have recognized this. The picture is of Temple Grandin. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Temple. And Preston and I have met her in different contexts. And Temple believes that instilling rituals in people who work with animals is important. And in no way, by the way, am I equating slaughterhouses or any kind of use of agricultural animals to what happens in a lab. But I'm just talking about the ritual component. And Temple has advocated for people who work as stockmen to develop rituals where they can acknowledge animals. And she herself says that when she walks into a slaughterhouse, she bows her head as a personal ritual to honoring the animals that she works with herself. Because of these features, the public nature of what's happening with Dare to Care, the bench, the inscription, I think their efforts, combined with your resiliency program, do what a lot of current CF measures don't. Traditionally, most CF measures, as you know, focus more on stress reduction. There are a number of programs that advocate yoga, mindfulness, exercise, meditation, diversifying work experience, maybe limiting euthanasia. And these are all, I think, very good measures to reduce stress, but when they're studied, they don't reduce CF. Stress can be a byproduct of CF, but I think CF is its own little beast to deal with. And the last study I read of these traditional measures of reducing CF found that over 80% of the people studied said that they had these measures, when studied, had no effect at all on their CF levels. Indeed, I think Dare to Care's compassion restoration, which is the term I sometimes use, is already serving as a model for other animal using institutions. Preston mentioned last night that you've had over 100 labs that have reached out to Sally and him to emulate Dare to Care. I believe there's even greater interest out there in their message. There are a couple of quotes from a piece that was in CompMed listserv, and it was on, would you be interested in having your institution have an animal tribute? And the responses were overwhelmingly, yes, I wish they could have them here. Sociologically, this response is interesting to me because to me, Dare to Care is what we call an emergent social movement. And with an emergent social movement, what you want to do is track its growth into a mature movement, which then has more impact. The most important predictor of impact is receptivity to your message. And I think from what I've been told and what I've read, that receptivity is there. So that augurs well for the future of Dare to Care. All of this suggests things are changing in bench science. And this is my little however. Some of the change will be slow, as you may recognize. What's still needed is buy-in from administrators into this kind of effort, but also buy-in from leading spokespeople from academics and the biomedical community who may not yet be on board. When I did my obligatory Google Scholar search, and I typed in all the possible words I could think of that deal with today's talk, I would find articles like this where in the title I thought, yes, now there are going to be articles talking about this very issue. They don't. This one about emotions and science mostly talks about the importance of researchers not losing their enthusiasm for their research, which, by the way, I'm not minimizing that. The word animal didn't appear in the article. This article solicited the opinions of 11 or 12 leaders in biomedical research to talk about the future of in vivo science. And one person mentioned animals, but that wasn't, again, in this context. He talked about the need for ethical animal research, which no one would argue against, but nothing about emotions was mentioned. Nevertheless, change is in the winds for bench science. And I think today's commemoration makes that ever so clear. I think to some people, the bench being dedicated today might seem like a small change, but in anthropology, the smallest change in a culture is big. There's a ripple effect, and a small change in attitude, a small change in behavior becomes noticeable over time. There's a lot of work in sociology on the impact of innovations in cultures, and that makes the same point. Even the business world acknowledges this. Professor Martin is a professor of business at University of Toronto, and he wrote a recent book about how to change corporate culture. And he said it comes back to altering a small individual behavior. It starts there. And that's, I think, what Dare to Care is doing. Finally, the efforts that I think Dare to Care provides, again, not limited to the bench and the plaque and the commemoration, will serve as small but powerful instruments of change in the culture of animal research. They can alter in minor but important ways how those working directly or indirectly with lab animals interact with each other as well as with the general public. The prospect over time is that these changes will foster dialogue between traditionally separated parties, permit feelings traditionally glossed over and not discussed to finally be aired, improve animal care, and make for even better science. They are harbingers of things to come. The future of bench science is here today. Thank you. Thank you.
That was great. That was great. Hi, I'm Zach Rosenkrantz. I work in the Office of Animal Welfare with Preston and a lot of other folks here. I thought now we could open the floor for a little question and answer section. If that's okay with you guys,
Sure,
Charlie?
sure. If there are any.
Does anybody have any questions?
Can you tell us why you thought the lab animal veterinarians were
Oh, yeah.
sickly?
Funny you should ask. A few reasons. One, I think some of it was methodological. I write qualitatively, and I think if I had provided the same information with some stats, they might have bought into it. So some reaction to qualitative fieldwork is all anecdotal. They dismiss that. But the other reason was, I think, when I would describe what I saw in labs, some of it, as I mentioned, were describing things that would be violating USDA regulations, which the lab animal vets were responsible for overseeing. So I think they saw me as showing that they weren't doing their work, although no one said that to me directly. So that's my hunch. But, yeah, sure.
I was wondering if you thought a lot about different species of animals and different reactions, because it seems like a lot of the stuff is mammals and all of it's vertebrates that you talked about.
Right.
What about invertebrates and reptiles, insects, fish, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I didn't get it. All my labs, I couldn't do that based on my research.
Okay.
And in fact, I should mention, all the labs I studied were really university-based labs. I didn't do private labs, cosmetics. They were all disease-related labs. And that would have been great. After 7 years and 17 labs, I had no more grant money. And I also ended it partially because people in the labs kept saying, study us, but you really should go to animal shelters. And they thought I should go to animal shelters because they thought the tensions I was observing in them, they said, would be magnified. Because back in the day, the numbers of animals being euthanized in shelters were astronomical compared to today. They thought that's something I should focus on. And I ended up spending 20 years in shelters after that. So maybe there's still time. Maybe I should go back and look at that. Yeah, go ahead.
Advice for somebody who's just starting out in a career in laboratory animal medicine or science?
Wow, that's a good question. Well, in laboratory, first of all, my observations are old. And I have no doubt that if I were to do the same study now, I would see a different, I would hope that there'd be a different response. In terms of lab animal vets, I must have studied about 10 of them at 10 institutions closely. I would shadow them. And the ones who had the best relationships with technicians and caretakers were most effective at what they did. And the ones that were more remote didn't. And I think that's commonsensical, but I could see it happen. The vets who just rarely appeared, there was a sense of let's hide things from them. And they hadn't built a relationship with them. The vets who were more part of the lab, individual lab culture, were consulted more, had a better relationship with them. They were still likely to hide things from them. Not because the vet said anything to them, but because people in the lab assumed it. There are all these assumptions that operate to do that. I recommend a good book, Larry Carbone, who's written, when I was doing my book, he was doing his on his experience in San Francisco. I think it's a wonderful book. I would have people read that book. But it's also very difficult work, I acknowledge that. Yeah.
Did you have pets growing up? And if so, what were they?
I did. I always had it. Good you ask. In fact, someone said I should show pictures of my pets, but I thought, we always had a dog. Always had dogs, as did many of the people in labs. I mean, one of my questions to people was that question, because sometimes people would be using the animal they have as a pet as the animal in the lab, and I could never understand that as an outsider. And now, by the way, I have cats. I've given up dogs and gone to cats. And I had fish, too. I used to breed fighting fish, and we had a bird. Actually, we had a zoo in our house now. The other thing, I immediately go back into my lab experience, and people would often put up pictures of their pets on their desks. And again, I thought, to me, that's sociologically interesting. You would love your pet, but I think they wanted to do that because their work was so unlike their experience with their animals at home, and they maintained their own humanity. So often there were walls of pets or favorites, and if they didn't have pets, they'd put up whatever animal they want to remind them of that other kind of animal than they worked with. Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah, Chris.
I just have a question. I'm surprised I didn't ask it to you last night at dinner, but I think one thing I've come to realize is the public is just not educated on what we do, and obviously I think it's a lot of our own fault for not talking about what we do, but just from a sociologist perspective, do we just do what we're doing and try to talk more about our work openly? Just kind of curious, if it's kind of our own end here, I think.
Yeah. How do you bring the public in more? Well, first I would look at what you're doing to bring the public in. When I think of Mahoney's lab, He actually, in a local newspaper, had a little ad once that saying there was like an open house in the lab, and which he didn't know what would happen after that. So one is I would think about how would someone in the local community even know what's going on here? You know, there's often miles apart, hundreds of miles apart from people. Secondly, I would think about why would someone want to hear more? You know, there's a certain audience out there, as you know, who's interested because they're upset and opposed to it. That's a built-in audience. But other than that, why would anyone else, what is it about that would pull them in? That would be, if you can find a master's student here who's writing a thesis, that would be actually a great way to use a local resource, to have them look at what is local community interest in research, maybe look at stereotypes they have, what additional information might the public want to have. But I saw no lab back then that ever wanted to consider that question except Jim's lab. But it's important. Yeah.
So how do you deal with this speciesism regarding different type of animals in lab research? Like people intrinsically places more value on non-human primates and rats.
Yep.
So do you think like all different animals deserve the same type of respect and care?
But do I think so? Yes.
Okay.
But do I observe that when I'm, no. I mean, the difference is striking. Again, I talked to Preston, and one of the things I would do in the lab where I was pushing the mouse cages, I would sit with the chief technician once a month, or roughly once a month, where she would do house cleaning, which was their euphemism for killing all the mice after the end of the study. And she would be in the chair next to me, and with rollers in the chair, and I'd be next to her, and she would perform cervical dislocation on blindfolded, maybe 300 or 400 in an afternoon. Now, I would go to a primate lab, and if one of the primates was at Mahoney's lab, this is, again, making your point, if one of the primates was being put down, at his lab, it was like a church service, and he would let people take off the day. He would do it himself. So it was completely different. So I don't have an answer for how it could be different, but I'm confirming there's remarkable differences in labs. Most of the labs I was in had rodents because, again, my era was the era where the cost of lab animals was pushing out a lot of dogs and cats, for instance. Primates are very expensive, so the vast majority of the labs I saw were using rodent models. So no easy answer to that question, but it's there. It's definitely there. Okay.
Great. You want me to help jump in? So thank you, everyone.
Sure.
Thank you. So we wouldn't have a commemoration without actually ribbon cutting, so I'm just going to give you guys a really quick debrief of what's coming. So we would like you to come out of the building with us right to the front entrance to the memorial, the dedication of the bench that Ernie was talking about.
Before we get started on the dedication of the bench, I just want to do a quick reminisce of how we got here, because as you heard from everyone, it's been a few years in the making. Starting off, you know, we just heard this amazing talk from Dr. Arluke. Preston gave you a little bit of introduction, but this particular ceremony and dedication originated several years ago as a kickoff project to support the people at the University of Washington that interact with research animals. It's meant to be all-inclusive, as you heard from both Preston and Dr. Arluke. This really is meant to recognize our caregivers, our veterinarians, our scientists, our facility personnel, and even everybody who just walks by and wants to understand how the University of Washington cares for the animals that we interact with. So first off, I do want to acknowledge the D2C committee that you see here, and the amazing work and strides they've made in putting together a program, seeing a vision, and making it real and accessible. Yes. So the D2C committee chair, Preston Van Heuser, who raised his hand to start this project and bring it to reality. The co-chair, Holly Wynn, who prefers to work in the shadows, but brings the committee's vision into focus with a website and all of her support. And then the vice chair, Rita Belanca, who has perpetuated the message and shared it broadly with other communities. Thank you to all of them, but really want to recognize all of the D2C members that are here in attendance. And we also want to recognize those who were previous members and those who have rotated off of the committee. Again, a big round of applause for this amazing group in the purple shirts. This bench is a testament to your hard work and dedication. I also want to give a quick shout out to some of the other people who worked behind the scenes to bring this to life. Sarah Shores from UW Campus Grounds Management, as well as the following UW facilities departments. The sign shop created the mock-up version of the plaque that you're going to see, the finished carpentry that did the inlays of the plaque, and they stained the bench and prepped the legs for mounting. And last but not least, the heavy equipment facilities group that actually mounts the bench and makes sure that it stays here for all of us to enjoy. So again, thank you to all for being here and joining us for this dedication ceremony. I am going to read the dedication because there's a lot of nuanced words in it and I don't want to mess it up, so I am going to read verbatim. I usually don't do that, but this time I'm going to. Okay, I'm going to start. In honor of research animals and the people of the University of Washington. This dedication is in tribute to the research animals and the compassionate people who interact with them to support advancements in science and pave the path of progress. This bench stands as a testament to the indomitable spirit of research animals and the unwavering dedication of those who cared for them and the invaluable partnership between the animals and the people. With unwavering gratitude, we acknowledge the contributions of these animals whose service has brought healing and hope to countless lives, played an indispensable role in advancing our understanding of the world, and illuminated the pathways of knowledge and medicine. Equally, we recognize the devoted people who, alongside these remarkable animals, have nurtured, protected, and advocated for the animals with love, compassion, and a commitment to their well-being. Together, animals and personnel that have worked with the animals have formed an unbreakable bond, a union of trust and mutual support that drives advancements in science while upholding the principles of empathy and respect. Their courage and resilience have propelled humanity forward, reminding us every step of discovery comes with profound responsibility. As we remember their contributions, we also recommit ourselves to the highest standards of ethical and humane research, ensuring that their legacy is one of progress and compassion. We pledge to continue pursuing research with a heart, advancing knowledge while safeguarding their lives. Let this dedication remind us of the ethical responsibility we carry as stewards of knowledge to ensure that their legacy is one of compassion and reverence. Our hope is that this bench becomes a place of reflection, a place where their contribution echoes through the generations of researchers who have been inspired by their unwavering spirit. When you sit on this bench, you will be reminded to uphold a future where science and compassion walk hand in hand as the symbol of the harmonious partnership between human curiosity and the animals who inspire us. This bench serves as a guiding light to steer us toward innovative and novel methods, ensuring that science remains a force for good in the world. Let us remember that in our pursuit of knowledge, we are united by our shared humanity and our shared responsibility toward all life. With profound respect and gratitude, we now turn it over to dedicate this bench.
think another huge thank you today goes out to the university for supporting this program and for letting everybody that worked really hard to make it happen do that work and make it happen, because I don't think it could have happened at a lot of other institutions. And I know a lot of places are using us as the example of how to create a successful program. So huge thank you to all of the Dare to Care program for their ongoing work, as well as putting on the commemoration today. So thank you very much. All right, and lastly, I have two lastlies, just like Preston. We'll do two lastlies. No slight to our fabulous, fabulous speaker, and no slight to Dare to Care, but the real thank you today goes out to all of you guys, all of the people that take care of the animals, all the people that support the programs, to our researchers, our faculty, our PIs, our research technicians, all of the people that I cannot name all of, and I know I will leave out 1,000 of them, but all of the people that make this possible, that's where the real gratitude goes today. Our people that are off-site that can't be here, thank you for dealing with 120-degree heat in Arizona, and thank you for taking care of the fish in Friday Harbor Labs and all over the world, the research that's happening because of what we're doing here today. So thank you to all of those groups. And very, very last, but certainly not least, is thank you to the animals. And that's really what today is about. So thank you to all of the animals.